The topic today is the Cold War, a term originally coined by George Orwell in his essay, You and the Atom Bomb. The Cold War mainly centered around tensions between two major world powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. But first of all, what exactly was the Cold War? There are three terms for three different types of wars. The first is a hot war, where all diplomatic attempts have failed and full-scale battles have erupted. The second war is a warm war, where peace is still negotiable, but armies have mobilized and are ready to fight. Our war is the Cold War. The actual two major countries did not fight for fear of appalling consequences, but client states fought for their beliefs on their behalfs in conflicts known as proxy wars.
Even before the end of World War II, it seemed that the Cold War had already begun. Although Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had allied against Nazi Germany in the Second World War, conflicts and distrust still developed between them. After World War II, the US and the Soviet Union clashed on multiple occasions. For example, when Harry S. Truman, the US president, wanted to enact the Marshall Plan, which gave Germany $13 billion to reindustrialize and reconstruct its country, Joseph Stalin attempted to separate the East and West of Europe by creating pro-communist governments in countries such as Poland and other Eastern nations, causing the Western nations to frantically try to stop the rapid expansion of Soviet influence. This gave rise to the term Iron Curtain, which Winston Churchill used to describe the severance of the democratic West and the communist East. Truman drew up the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which aided the European countries that were threatened by the Soviet communist takeover. The Western Bloc formed the NATO alliance, while the Eastern Bloc formed the Warsaw Pact. Countries around the world were pressured to take sides, but other countries like India refused to take sides. This was known as non-alignment.
Also after World War II, Germany was partitioned into 4 zones overseen by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The Soviet Union wanted all of Germany to itself, so in June of 1948 they blocked off all transportation routes into Berlin so that the only way to bring supplies in was by air travel. This blockade lasted for more than a year. Afterwards, Germany was split into an Eastern Communist side, mainly the USSR, and a Western Democratic side, including the 3 partitions of the United States, Britain, and France. Berlin was also split with the rising of the Berlin Wall, which stood to prevent defection from East Germany for almost 3 decades, from August 13, 1961 to November 9, 1989. To help with morale in the city, pilots would drop little parachutes attached to candy called Operation Little Vittles.
Before the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1956 in the Middle East, Egypt attempted to take control of the Suez Canal. Gamal Abdel Nasser's goal was to modernize Egypt, starting with the construction of the Aswan Dam. The US and UK agreed to the loaning of money to Egypt, but then reneged on their agreement because of the Egyptian relation to Soviet military and politics. Obviously upset, Nasser took control of the Suez Canal in order to fund the Aswan Dam by charging for passage. Because the British, French, and the Israelis opposed some Egyptian policies at the time, they used this issue as a reason to attack. After the Suez Crisis, it revealed that Britain would never quite reach the height of previous times and cemented the major world hold of the United States and Soviet Union.
In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully developed its own atomic bomb, which shocked the world. From then on, an arms race would take place with the United States into the 1980s. Although both countries would gain the ability to essentially wipe out the human race, both feared the consequences. They established an agreement called MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction. If one country first attacked another, the second country could attack the first and destroy no matter how bad the previous magnitude of harm. This is why there was never use of nuclear weapons. The cost was too high. Perhaps the closest the Cold War ever got to a full-on nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union began attempts to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, which was headed by Fidel Castro and his communist government. Obviously, the United States worried about this. Seeing as the closest distance from Cuba to America was mere 90 miles, the US President John F. Kennedy set up a revolt called the Bay of Pigs for anti-Castro exiles to rebel against the government. But the plan failed because of the preeminent preparation of the Cuban authorities and ultimately did not take place. Kennedy also set up a naval blockade and made it clear that if missiles were to be launched from Cuba, the United States would retaliate against the Soviet Union. After 3 months, an agreement was made to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba, and the United States removed nuclear weapons from Turkey and Italy as well.
Another contest for technology and innovation took place during the Cold War as well, the space race. During 1955 to 1972, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a competition to one-up the other with space inventions. Each nation recruited German scientists to help with the development of such machines. The Soviet Union initially led with putting the first man into orbit, but on July 20, 1969, after the launching of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, where he famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Near the end of the space race, relations between the two nations had begun to improve, and the first US-Soviet joint project, the Apollo-Soyuz, took place, effectively ending the space race.
In the Cold War, the term Red Scare came to use. It was used to describe periods of extreme anti-communism in the United States. Red comes from the color of the Soviet Union flag. Scare comes from the fact that many people were worried that communism would come to the United States. There were two Red Scare periods. The first occurred after World War I and the Russian Revolution. The second occurred during the Cold War after World War II. People, especially in the United States, were frightened at the prospect of a communist takeover.
America's Cold War years were filled with fear.
During the Cold War, many proxy wars were fought for the beliefs of either communism or democracy. The Korean War was fought between the North and South side, backed by the Soviet Union and the United States, respectively. The Vietnam War was also fought between a communist North and anti-communist South, again backed by communist countries such as China and the Soviet Union and anti-communist countries, mainly the United States. This war was a devastating blow to the United States, as it not only fought for 20 years, but had also lost Vietnam to the communists. The Chinese Civil War marked a long period of turmoil between the nationalist government, or Kuomintang, and the Communist Party. Even today, the rivalry still exists between the victorious Communist Party and the nationalists who fled to the island of Taiwan. The Yom Kippur War initially began when the Arab states of Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, heightening tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States as each considered allying with their respective countries. Many feared this would eventually lead to the Third World War. Fortunately, a ceasefire was successfully negotiated. The Soviet-Afghanistan War was fought between Afghanistan rebels called the Mujahideen and the Soviet-supported Afghanistan government. The United States supported the Afghanistan rebels in order to try and overthrow the communist government and to prevent the spread of communism.
Perhaps the most prominent signal of the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was the collapse of the Soviet Union that started in the late 1980s and was complete when the country broke up into 15 independent states on December 25, 1991. Those 15 independent states were Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. This breakdown produced new ethnic and civil issues in places such as Yugoslavia.
Effects of the war varied depending on the location. In Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War had ushered in an era of economic growth and a large increase in the number of liberal democracies. While in other parts of the world, such as Afghanistan, independence was accompanied by state failure.
Another reason for celebration took place in the event of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and with it, the shedding of the Iron Curtain. No longer would families be separated and a nation be torn by the ideas of equality or justice.
Because there was no formalized treaty ending the Cold War, the former superpowers have continued to various degrees, depending on their respective economies, to maintain and even improve or modify existing nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Moreover, other nations not previously acknowledged as nuclear weapon states have developed and tested nuclear explosive devices. Countries had the responsibility of controlling and stabilizing their nuclear forces, but over time, terrorists and hackers have interfered with that nuclear stability and confidence.
The enduring benefits of the end of the Cold War can be summed up in the ensuing era of comparative peace and prosperity. The availability of new technologies for nuclear power and energy, and the use of radiation for improving medical treatment and health. Environmental remediation, industrial production, research science, and technology development have all been benefited from the carefully managed application of radiation and other nuclear processes.
Overall, the Cold War brought tragedy in all parts of the world through death, debt, and devastation. But it also demonstrated the ability to hold back on the complete destruction of the human race, even with the capability to do so.
And that, as seen in the previous two world wars, is an accomplishment in and of itself. Thank you for watching.